Welcome to the Corruption and Crime Commission's podcast series, where we demystify the inner workings of an organisation perceived to be secretive. History proves that public health emergencies and corruption often go hand in hand. Today we chat with the heads of Western Australia's two premier government integrity bodies and ask, with the huge amounts of money required to respond to COVID-19, could it lead to a corruption crisis in our state? Well, let's get into the conversation. Enjoy. Welcome Public Sector Commissioner and COVID State Recovery Controller Sharon O'Neill and Corruption and Crime Commissioner John McKechnie QC. Between the CCC and the PSC, you've really got the public sector covered when it comes to any kind of misconduct or corruption. But what's the difference between the two of you and how much do you work together?
Well, at the Public Sector Commission, our role is particularly to look at what's called minor misconduct. What's interesting about that is it's often anything but minor. So there is some definitional differences between what we do at the Public Sector Commission and what the CCC do. So our role is around minor misconduct, and we have a large role in encouraging people to come forward and give us their observations of what's happening in the public sector in terms of conduct. And also just people out in the general public can do that as well. So minor misconduct are things that could lead to someone losing their job in the public sector. But it doesn't really matter how big or how small it is. In the Public Sector Commission, our role is to make sure agencies manage those complaints well and that we protect the public purse, which is, of course, the same aim that the CCC has as well, the hard-earned dollars of Western Australians, that we make sure that that money is dealt with respectfully and that people who are working in the public sector do the right thing day in and day out, which mostly they do. Sometimes they don't. And so part of our role is educative, teaching people about the right processes to take. But I don't think you should have to teach people about what's right and wrong, but apparently sometimes we've got to remind them.
Commissioner McKechnie, how easy is the demarcation for you?
It's very easy, and we work very closely with the Public Sector Commission. Our focus is on serious misconduct, real corruption in both public sector employees, and also our remit is broader, can take in elected officials such as parliamentarians and local government councillors. But we are looking for major corruption.
But should we all assume that there's a bit of a hotline between the two of you?
Yes, we communicate very regularly. We've told people they can make allegations to either of us. We'll sort it out. And if it's minor misconduct, we'll send it off to PSC and vice versa.
So, Commissioner O'Neill, in this COVID era, we all know that COVID-19 has led to rapid change socially, economically, and organisations have had to pivot, as the management speak goes. They've had to reprioritise. And that can make public authorities more vulnerable to misconduct and corruption, can't it?
Yes, possibly. I think that potential is there when the speed is perhaps more amped up than normal. Processes are shortened during the COVID era. We had to move really quickly. We had to do things a little differently, always with integrity in mind. But whenever you're changing a process, whenever you're having to move, I think, in different ways, there's the potential there. And so I asked all public authorities to be even more attentive to that potential threat.
Commissioner McKechnie, you often say corruption hides in the shadows. Do you think that the challenging times like the one we're going through here with COVID-19, those times that bring uncertainty and rapid change, present greater integrity risks at your level, at the serious misconduct level?
Yes, I think there are more shadows to hide within. And as Sharon said, there's a range of challenges that COVID has brought in. Governments and the state government, for very good reason, has pumped money into the economy through infrastructure and other projects. And sometimes in order to get it out, to keep the economy functioning, some of the safeguards may not have been met or are ignored. So in those situations, there's an obvious vulnerability that somebody might take advantage of and line their own pockets.
Commissioner O'Neill, I'm interested in your insights as the COVID-19 State Recovery Controller. How do you maintain integrity during a crisis, and what kind of actions should authorities take to minimise risk and avoid being taken advantage of by public officers who might see an opportunity for corruption?
Well, during COVID, there was enormous pace. This state put more than $5 billion into recovery. So, there was great effort put into supporting Western Australia going forward. And because of that, there was a lot of opportunity to do things differently. But nonetheless, the expectation certainly from my perspective to agencies, is that controls need to be maintained and, in fact, improved. So, I meet with the Director Generals of all the departments every couple of weeks. It was very high on our agenda to ensure that the governance is good. So even though we're in a COVID era, there's no change to the emphasis on the rules, the reporting, the emphasis, senior people getting together, talking about it. That nothing replaces the culture of an organisation, particularly at these times of crisis. So setting really clear expectations. This is how we do things here, for staff, for people they work with. And so it's not that there were brand new, different things that we put into place. It's just that we had to be even more conscious of the expectations that we already have. But I think vigilance, and so getting senior managers or people that are working with departments to be even more critical of what they have in front of them, about the decisions that are being made, about the reasons why and the way we'll go about our work. Because it's good practice. In a crisis, not in a crisis, the expectations have never dropped. In fact, they were increased.
Government was certainly trying to fast-track investment, as you say, put money into the economy. And there was a sense that agencies needed to cut any red tape that might have been there to enable that injection. But that didn't mean cutting corners, did it?
Absolutely. So cutting red tape is cutting unnecessary bureaucracy, and we would love that outside of COVID, let alone inside COVID. So that's always an aim. But knowing the non-negotiables, they're the things you don't cut. And so being really clear around the key aspects you have to have in place to ensure that the shadows don't grow or aren't maximised for an individual's benefit. So I think that's really important, that there's not a sentiment of cutting corners. We've never promoted that, and the Director Generals have been, I think, fantastic around this, but we spent a lot of time working out where are the bits that really are in this moment unnecessary or adding time and effort that we couldn't really afford.
I guess COVID's a time when we really rely on the integrity of our public servants, that word trust, that word integrity.
Well, the key is good governance. The key for any department is good governance, right from the top. People talk about culture and departmental culture, and in my time I've seen good culture and bad culture. But the key is good governance. Misconduct is a risk, like any other risk, and it is to be managed by the Director General, the CEO, or whoever. If it's not managed well, then corruption can flourish, often in the shadows. When you have departments that have multi-billion-dollar budgets, you cannot depend on rulings from on high. You have to trust, but you have to have proper processes, proper procedures, and people following those procedures to protect the public purse.
Commissioner O'Neill, culture, what are your insights about that word?
Well, a positive, strong culture of integrity is hard fought to win. So you've got to work on it day in and day out. It's easy, reputation and culture is easy lost. And so we've had examples of that over the years. So it takes every single person to contribute to a culture of integrity. It has to be upfront. And every time that someone sees an activity that is not in line with that culture, I think the reaction to that has to be swift and, in my view, public about what's tolerated here. So culture is just personality. It's personality of an organisation. And the symbols that you have in place demonstrate that. The processes you have in place demonstrate that, as a way of working. And so I think that it needs to be proactive. It needs to be deliberate. A lot of people see culture as just something that evolves here, how happy we are. That's not my view of culture. My view of culture is that you plan deliberately to improve it and to put a really clear expectation out to people who work for you about how things work in that place.
And of course, the theme of this year's International Anti-Corruption Day is your right, your role, say no to corruption. So what would you say to someone who has seen or knows about wrongdoing or misconduct in the WA government public sector?
Well, speak up is the simple answer to that, but we know it's not always that simple. But there are protections for people who call out bad behaviour. It's just not something that we think is is a nice thing to do. It's the right thing to do. And, the work that we do and the money that we administer in the public sector is off the hard work of, battling and other Western Australians. So we have a big responsibility in terms of how we use that money. And so when you see something that isn't right or doesn't feel or look right, or you're even uncertain, talk to someone about it. Just so important that we all do that.
The standards we walk by are the standards we accept. So everybody has a responsibility when they see something. But it is hard. It's easy if you have people that you trust above the person who may be committing the misconduct. It is difficult when it may be the CEO themselves who are misconducting themselves. That's why you have the Public Sector Commission, you have the Corruption Commission as an outside agency that people can come to.
So it's everyone's responsibility, but we know that managers are a key control in minimising the risks of misconduct and corruption. So what are some of the integrity tips for managers listening today?
From the Public Sector Commission's perspective, we're developing some resources and helpful guidance for managers. But the helpful tip number one, I guess, is to be very clear about the behaviour that's expected in your organisation, to make it clear to staff, to help them understand it. So if you talk about it in pretty woolly general terms, not everyone gets it. So talk concretely about the kinds of behaviours that we expect to see here. That's my first management tip, is set clear expectations to teach people about what it means. But when you don't see it, or when people don't meet that mark, do something about it. That's good management anyway. Acknowledge and celebrate when it's done well, but go hard when it's not, because working in the public sector is an enormous privilege, but it's also an enormous responsibility. We've got a responsibility as managers to be at our best on the score of integrity.
We've been talking about public servants, but of course your net goes wider than public servants into the business sector and the community. Do you think those people realise, do you think everyone realises that they could be in the spotlight too? We all interface with public servants.
No, I don't think people do, although they should, because quite a number of our reports have identified people outside the public sector who have misbehaved. Some have been prosecuted. Many have pleaded guilty to quite serious offences. I don't think people realise that giving a bribe is as bad as receiving a bribe. You don't get points cut off because you're not a public sector employee. Both will be in trouble.
Marie, just on that, the other important part for people that work in government is also for them to be setting an expectation for the businesses that they work with. That's kind of new. We haven't talked about that so much over the years. So, as I talk to them, saying to government departments, make your expectation clear of contractors, of businesses that provide you with things in government, about how you're going to do your work. Don't offer us gifts. We're not going to take them. That's how we do it here in the government sector. And so I think, we need to set a standard also with the people that sit outside a government but work with government. And that's kind of an evolving area too.
I think that's very important because there are a lot of departments that supplement their work with contractors. IT is a particular example. There are a lot of IT contractors. They should be held to exactly the same standards, but often I've seen they're not really. People don't know where to put them. And yet they're dealing with public monies the same as the public service at the desk next to them. I think it's an emerging area that we need to do more work on.
But really what you're both saying is that if organisations expect to do business with the public sector, their standards of integrity need to be as high.
Yes, that's right. And I think it's not just our employees, it's the people we do business with.
And the problem with gifts is a sort of perpetual irritant. Every time we think we've got the message out, we find another case. Either Sharon does or we do. And the simple answer is you shouldn't get a gift for doing your job. It's as simple as that. Now, it may be common in the private sector, and that spills over. People who are working with government should know, do not offer gifts. Public sector employees should know, do not accept it. There may be nothing in the gift, it may be a small bottle of wine or something, but there's an expectation and a perception of favouritism.
And I guess that might be one of the red flags. You've said that most public officers come to work and do the right thing, but there are some, and they've been the subject of your reports, Commissioner McKechnie, over recent times, who do engage in misconduct and sometimes on a very large scale. So apart from beautiful bottles of wine, what are some of the red flags that people should keep their eyes open for?
Well, none of these, of course, are definitive, but here are a few. One, a person who's perpetually in chaos, in mess and so forth. Maybe their natural state, but it's a good way to hide corruption just by, oh, well, I'm terribly sorry, I'm incompetent, I never got the paperwork done. That's a red flag for me. Another red flag are people who have a lifestyle that might include significant gaming, either at the casino or the horses. If they're an ordinary public servant, where do they get the money? So those are a couple of red flags. The third is somebody who may be going through a crisis at home that may be unknown, and they go off the rails for a time. So there's three for a start.
And there's also the one, that red flag where people don't like other people either doing their work or looking at their work. And so, Commissioner, you've talked about people who don't take much leave as a red flag, something to look at.
Big red flag.
Yeah. So that that sense that other people are going to be able to see into what's going on, and so all of these flags, looking across them all is a really important part of what we do.
And you can also look at who, male, middle to senior level manager, who may have a reputation for getting things done. Gee, he cuts corners, but boy, does he get the job done. And it's the cutting corners that's sometimes a corruption problem. A male who's perhaps risen to where they're going to go and is a bit of a bully, intimidates people below them from complaining. On the female side, not exclusively of course, the trusted subordinate, the secretary, the EA who's arranging travel and other things and is not really noticed until one day, we've got a big problem. So those are not exactly red flags, but they fit a type of person who, with other things, may be an indicator of corruption.
And just those people who are afraid to ask questions, who are unwilling to ask the next question, because the things that we look at aren't always ripping the state off to large sums of money. They can be much smaller things about someone getting a benefit in a job promotion or those sorts of scenarios. So sometimes, we have people who are just afraid to ask a couple more questions. And so, there's a red flag because they're more easily influenced perhaps to make minor changes.
Commissioner O'Neill, do you see the kind of gender divide that Commissioner McKechnie speaks of?
Well, if you look at some of the research, over many years in the cases here and some of the cases in the East, some of the evidence bears out a pattern. But it's never just, one thing or another thing. It's a combination of all the red flags that we've looked at. So, neither of us would say it's, older men or it's younger women or, you can never be that definitive. But again, these red flags are just things to be conscious of. We don't run around with a list, working out who might fit in, but it's the discipline of our managers having these ideas in their mind so that they can be constantly thinking in the back of their head that it's possible.
And the red flags can be a bit harsh because we say, well, look at all the red flags in this, but we're usually saying that in hindsight. In hindsight, we see the behaviour and then we say, oh, yes, it was a male, it was this, it was that, they were overbearing and so forth. In hindsight, the red flags are easy to see. It's harder in foresight, and it's particularly hard when it's your boss.
Question without notice. Where we've been so lucky in Western Australia through the COVID-19 pandemic to date, but what's ahead of us and what's the shape of the risk ahead of us?
Well, we might come out of COVID in the next period. We've got announcements about transition plans next year. So I think COVID will still dominate, but it'll be a different feel, I suppose, going into next year. We've got vaccination. People might have heard recently about some people doing the wrong thing to avoid being vaccinated. So, alive and well, people avoiding rules and avoiding doing the right thing. And so I think we're going to have some of that, into next year. We don't know where the next corner is because, lack of integrity can find its way, or misconduct or corruption can find its way, it seems, into any nook and cranny. So it's a bit hard to forecast, where the next playing field for poor behaviour will be. It's always around us. The potential is always around us where there's money and where there's people and where there's influence. And so not really sure what the next frontier will be as we're going through staff shortages perhaps in areas of the public sector or new initiatives. The possibility is always there.
Commissioner McKechnie, I guess the overarching message is to always keep our antenna up.
Yes, I don't want to overstate it because Australia is, relatively speaking, very corruption-free. It ranks, I think, 11 on the Transparency International Corruption Perception Index. Western Australia is in good shape. We get a somewhat jaundiced view, I think, Sharon and I, because we see the bad bits, not the 230 or 40,000 good, honest public servants. We just see the few who are bad. So we have a jaundiced view. But in my experience in the last 6 years, we have to keep vigilant. People have to keep vigilant. There will always be someone who's prepared to take advantage to gain a benefit, whatever that benefit might be. And we depend on honest public sector employees to let us know.
Commissioner O'Neill, a final message for the public sector.
If you want to come and work in the public sector, we'd love you to come. But you need to understand that we have a standard of behaviour that we expect. Most people do the right thing, and I'm very, very proud of the Western Australian public sector for that. But if you're coming to work with us, expect that we have set a standard for your behaviour, and that's what we'll be looking for.
A big thank you to Public Sector Commissioner Sharon O'Neill for being a special guest, and thank you to Commissioner McKechnie. Thank you for listening to the Corruption and Crime Commission's podcast. To listen to more podcasts, visit www.cccc.wa.gov.au or follow us on Twitter, LinkedIn or YouTube.